So, thank you very much for coming out on a cold and damp night. It's a real pleasure to be here. I changed the title slightly. I was going to talk exclusively about plants, but because much of the issue that I do want to discuss is also clearly related to the production and the consumption of animals, I thought I would just put food in there, and you'll see why I think animals raise so many questions for us. What I want to try to do in the 40 minutes or so that I have is to raise a number of questions. I'm certainly going to try not to necessarily answer them. This is a really complex set of issues. I mean, many of you here know a lot more about this than I do, and so I feel slightly humble. But I think what I would like to do at the end is to have a discussion, and we could have a debate around the merits or otherwise of particular approaches. I'm a production scientist. I started out as a farmer. We had a market garden down to the west of London, and that's where I developed my interest in plants. I've always had an interest in food, and working in Lancaster, I've been very fortunate to have colleagues who have similar sorts of interests, and we've had quite a substantial effort going, trying to do science in my case, but we have many very talented social scientists in the group also. Becky is one of those. But our scientists have tried to do science that somebody wants. And most recently, for the last 10 years or so, since people have become so concerned about our capacity to feed the world, we have tried to focus that science on exactly that set of issues. That said, I'm definitely not going to argue to you that we can solve this problem in any sense by simply producing more food, and that's going to be a theme that will run around this discussion. Please do interrupt if I say anything which you find completely outrageous or you think is obviously wrong, or you just like to know more. So this really introduces what I'm going to say. Very large numbers of people, a population predicted to peak around 9 billion before very long. We live on a planet where there is an increasing demand for food as a result of all of those extra mouths, and also the fact that many people are becoming more prosperous and they want to eat different things, and those things are often quite demanding to produce in terms of the resources which go into food production. We have a very substantial, significant, growing shortage of resources which are essential for the production of food using the systems that we currently employ. Energy, there's massive increase in demand for energy. And this combination of factors in concert with a climate which in my view is undoubtedly changing, and we'll talk a little bit about that, has produced something that our previous chief scientist, John Beddington, described as the perfect storm. And you can see that in the top line up there. And that's something that a title, a strap line that's really caught people's attention. And it's very commonly used now. So I want to start out just simply by outlining some of the issues. Many of these, of course, are going to be well known to you. This is what we imagine will happen in terms of the number of people on the planet. Many of the extra mouths will be in developing countries. Many of those people will live in cities. Now, for the first time ever, more people live in cities than in rural environments. And so this is potentially a massive, massive issue in terms of simply providing people with enough food. But of course, there are many other issues associated with that. This is a slide which compares the UK with India. We can see the distribution of ages, very large numbers of people here, young people feeding through into the population. I want to just spend a little bit longer on this side of the diagram, which shows the emerging middle class. And we can see the blue line is for the world, the red line underneath is for Asia Pacific. As these economies grow, people are interested in better lives and they want to eat different things. And we have worked a lot in China. The Chinese diet, when we started working there, was very largely vegetables, and now there is this enormous demand for meat and dairy. And this shows our technology strategy boards published a lot of information in this area. They're putting money into research to address some of these problems. This suggests this global demand for food, and you can see the expectation is that we need more milk, we need more dairy, and we need more meat to meet people's aspirations, and probably a few more vegetables as well. So why have I talked about meat as opposed to a vegetarian diet? Well, my main interest is in the use of water in food production, and you can see this stark contrast. People who eat a meat-rich diet, the amount of water that's required to produce that diet, very, very large amount of water per person per day compared to the water that's required to produce a vegetarian diet. And I think the difference in those statistics raise an immediate challenge for us. It may not be a challenge necessarily for scientists unless it's a challenge to produce meat with less water, which may well be possible, but it may be a challenge to start to think about influencing people's behavior and having more of a debate around what's to eat. And this is such a big difference here. There are quite a lot of stark statistics around suggesting that the impact of actually just saying to people, well, have one day a week without meat, the impact of that on the environment through a reduced use of water in agriculture would be much larger than many of the other more high-profile things that we could potentially do. So this idea of asking people to think about the way that they lead their lives is an important one. And these just are some data from China very quickly. This is the amount of water used in agriculture in China, and this is where we work. We tend to work in this blue bit at the bottom, which is the production of cereals. And you can see the cereal growers have been really rather good at limiting their resources. You'll see a bit later how food production in China has skyrocketed in the last 50 years, but it's been done relatively efficiently. You can see here that most of the extra water that's been used since, say, 1990s or 1980s has gone into the production of animal products. Now, there's an acute shortage of water in most areas of China. I'll show you a manifestation of that. This just cannot be sustained. And these are some stark statistics. Some of you will be familiar with this. WWF Ecological Footprint, published a couple of years ago now. I think it was 2012. It's disappeared behind here. The details, well, there are too many details to spend time on, but just look at the last sentence here. If everyone lived like an average resident of the USA, and we could put probably Northern Europe in there, a total of 4 Earths would be required to regenerate humanity's annual demand on nature. So we need more than this planet to live a life that many people around the world aspire to. So again, there's a challenge there to, is it necessary for everybody to eat like a resident of the USA? Is it actually even necessarily good for them? Another very large issue, which could be certainly a target for science, certainly it could be something that we would talk about here, is that growth in demand, I said at the outset, to try to move towards this target of feeding extra people, we don't necessarily have to produce more, we could waste less. up to 40% of the food that we produce is wasted. And so there's an obvious opportunity there to waste less and feed more people. Now that sounds pretty straightforward, but asking people to change their behaviour is quite a complex issue. So again, there are some things to think and talk about there. And of course, many, I'll say of us, eat too much. It's not good for us. And we had a discussion around this point in the department a few weeks ago over whether actually this is wasting food, and I think I believe that it is. We can do something about this, and we can feed more people as a result, but we can increase the health and the well-being of the people that we currently do have. And many people's view is that Western diets are a dangerously aspirational target. We should be thinking much more about what we eat. Now, I've put a target for question mark there because, again, science potentially could do something about this, but again, I think this is a strong behavioural issue. A lot of complex thinking, I think, needs to be done in this area. So that's just a general run through of some of the issues and some of the opportunities. This is a slide that shows us really what food security, a term that's commonly used in the press, or the food system, is all about. And it isn't, as I've said, just about producing more food to increase food availability. There are other components, even to that seemingly quite simple aspiration. The distribution of food is very, very important, and it's a major, major issue in many parts of the world. In addition to that, there are questions of food, the access that people have to food. There may be lots of food, but they may not be able to afford it. They may prefer other kinds of food, traditionally, culturally, or religiously. And the way in which the nutritional value of food, the social value of food, the safety of food is another thing which has an impact on how food is utilised. So those are the foodie issues, and those are all key, and I'm going to talk about each of those briefly in turn, but there are two other big components here, some of which have absolutely nothing to do with food, but have a key impact on this. They're environmental issues. Many of the things I've discussed already should be obvious to you. If we're using too much water to produce food, then almost inevitably the natural environment is suffering. So there are all kinds of environmental effects. Agriculture delivers lots of services, and we need to pay attention to those. We need to try to value those appropriately, and I'll say a little bit about that. And we need to say a little bit about the impact of economics and social welfare, social capital, political capital, people's lives on this, and I'll try and say a little bit about that. So I'm going to consider each of those compartments in turn briefly. I'll spend a little bit of time initially on production because that is where we've done most of our work, and I did build this as a talk about plants, so I do want to say something about plants. But before I move on to that, I just want to say that often changing priorities in any one or more of these areas, the impacts of that are not so easy to predict. There are lots of, some people would say, trade-offs in here, but actually they are more commonly conflicts. And there is a lot of potential for conflict in here, and I'll say a little bit about that when we discuss social welfare. So let me just say quickly about food availability and some of the things that we're doing. And I want to preface that by saying that I'm going to be talking across the scales. I am going to try and paint a big picture, but the scales are linked, and I think the way we lead our lives and communities operate or not operate particularly effectively or otherwise, are all key to this. Lancaster has a lot of people who are interested in it. Sustainable food production and consumption. There's a Sustainable Food Cities group, and that's really very, very important work, and we should discuss some of that probably this evening if we have time, but it's not divorced entirely from the kinds of things that go on at the global scale, and I'll try and illustrate some of that to you. So first of all, food production, and those are some predictions of how food production may have to change in order to feed all of these extra mouths. And there is this proposal that food production will have to double by 2050 if we're to avoid catastrophic problems with hunger. Now, I'm an optimist, but I'm not convinced that we could possibly approach a doubling of food production by 2050, even with all of the potential of the opportunities that new science and old science and existing science offers. I think, it's clear, or it seems clear to me, that we really do have to address all of these other components as well. The question is, how much is possible? Is it possible to really do more to push up production in the way that is predicted there? If you just try to fix the slope of those lines in your mind, just have a look at that. That's actually what's happened now. The previous slide was what we think is necessary. That's where we are, and actually wheat growers around the world are pretty convinced that yield increases have stalled, that despite all the efforts of all the geneticists and all the agronomists and all the brains and the enormous amounts of money that go into plant breeding, wheat yields year on year are not increasing. So we've just said maybe we have to double food production. So this suggests to us that we need some pretty dramatic action. Climate change is not going to make things any easier. There are all sorts of predictions. Again, many of you will be aware of this. And this shows you where some of the really catastrophic effects are predicted to occur. And this is between 15 and 50% less yield against a challenge to actually double yield. And so, this may not be absolutely right, but it's not going to be dramatically wrong. And the work that's doing now, this is some work by a very talented man in the United States called David LaBelle, who, rather than looking forward and trying to predict what's happened, has actually analysed yield data for a number of crops over the last 50 years or so. And you can see that this analysis suggests that already yields are limited. This is against all of the progress that we've made in genetics and mechanization and the way we produce crops and the development of herbicides and fertilizers and all of this. The suggestion is that we already have seen difficulties, and I suspect if there are any farmers, growers in the audience, it'd be very interesting to hear from you to see whether this is actually your experience. A lot of variation in this kind of thing, but I think most producers feel that certainly things aren't getting any easier. Now, it is possible to increase food production dramatically, and here are some data from an analysis that we did a few years ago now for agriculture in China, and the red line is grain yield in their most productive area. And you can see that that's a green revolution. It's a dramatic success story, and the stimulus for that was absolutely grinding poverty, hunger, malnutrition, mass starvation, very, very large numbers of people dying in China in the 1960s. And the government got a grip of this, and policies were introduced to boost food production. And in many, many areas, that has been quite successful, but you can see how that's been achieved by a massive use of resources. There's some genetics in that as well, but enormous uses of fertilizer, irrigation, plastic film. There are statistics on the amount of agricultural land that China has, and I should have just boned up on this. I think it's something like 7%, but they use 30% of the fertilizer in the world or something like this. So you can achieve that, but there is some massive environmental cost to it, and we can't carry on doing that. So we look at these challenges that I've just sort of outlined to you, and that overall the challenge is to produce more with less. There's no doubt about that, under very much more difficult conditions, and probably in soils which are declining in poverty, and that is a massive challenge. But as I say, I am an optimist. We're involved in a project in the Indo-Gangetic Plain in North India. This is the main wheat growing region in India. You can see that the predictions for this region, because of the developing climatic stress, are that yields will decline in the next 30 years by between 20 and 50%. And it's these kinds of statistics which get policymakers so concerned about these kinds of challenges. You can see very large numbers of people, excessive use of water, reduced groundwater levels, enormous environmental damage. And so the challenge is to produce more with less, and Lancaster is involved in a massive international project, multi-million-pound project, led in Mexico by CIMMYT. And CIMMYT is the international maize and wheat breeding station. It's funded by global governments, and it was the station where the original green revolution first took hold. They produced dwarf wheats, they sent them around the world, and this had a massive impact on food production, on people's health and well-being. So CIMMYT is coordinating this. I don't want to spend too much time on the details of the science, but it's actually quite a simple proposition. Got to get the plants to fix more carbon. Those of you that have been doing photosynthesis in school maybe will know all about that. Plants fix carbon from the atmosphere to make carbon skeletons, which is how the plant grows. But you need to get that carbon into the grains. It needs to go to the right place. So it's no good having a bigger plant if the resources don't go into the grains. So you need more carbon, you need to get it to the right place. And we know quite a lot about that biology. So it could be manipulated. It might almost inevitably need some genetic modification to do it within the next 30 years. And it will cost 80 to 100 million pounds. Now we're involved in this, and as you can imagine, it's quite it's a humbling experience to be part of it. People from all around the world looking to try to change the wheat plant, which is so important for so many people around the world as a food substance, in order to provide people with enough to eat. So, the younger people here who are thinking about careers and think, I might be interested in biology, then traditionally most people go into animal biology because animals run after sticks and they're much more interesting than plants for most people. But if you really want something worthwhile to do, this kind of challenge, believe me, is worth it. So this is Norman Borlaug, who did the original transformation of wheat plants to make them higher yielding. And you'll see that he died a few years ago. Had he lived, he would have been 100 next March. And there's a big celebration in Mexico of his 100th birthday. But the CIMMYT, the station in Mexico, is dedicated to this quest to just simply increase the productivity of two of our major food crops. And the really impressive thing about CIMMYT is that it is science for the public good. So they breed of all these varieties, they distribute them around the world. You can see there, these are places where their varieties are trialled, and they make the seeds available for nothing. So it's a massive effort coordinated by the United Nations. And so it's not a case of really anybody making any money out of this. It's a genuinely science for the public good. Now that's a big scale project. I've just come back from a meeting this morning in the south of England where we were meeting with Waitrose and their suppliers. Another of our projects in Lancaster is to work with Waitrose, its suppliers and its producers. And we're in this box, obviously. And the idea of this effort is a collaborative effort with the company and the suppliers and producers, the farmers, defining the agenda with the researchers trying to respond to that agenda. So it links science with business. And in Lancaster, generally, there's been a much greater emphasis on this in recent years. And this has proved to be quite a fruitful collaboration for us. They have a website, Sustainable Agriculture Waitrose, which you might want to have a look at. I say they, we're also involved in this. The idea is to try to work to enhance best practice in the business. And some of you might be surprised in this, because in the food area, food campaigners will often talk about the big retailers as part of the problem. And I wouldn't necessarily deny that, but here is a company that is genuinely interested in producing food in the right way and paying attention to the impact of agriculture on the environment as well as the impact of environment on agriculture. And if I have time, which I probably won't, I'll say a little bit more about that. I want to say a little bit about food utilization and safety. We're involved in a project which is actually led by the University of Aberdeen, for somebody who is a former student here actually, and we're looking at different ways of growing rice, which is another one of the world's major crops. We use enormous amounts of water to grow rice, and so we're looking to try to grow rice with less water to produce more crop per drop. But the really interesting aspect of this is that if you grow rice with less water, you can impact on its nutritional quality. And we have been working on a technique called deficit irrigation, giving plants less water than they would ideally require and trying to make that water produce more. And if you apply deficit irrigation to rice in the field, in the region of Bangladesh, where we work, I should have shown you on the previous slide, you can see quite a positive impact on the arsenic content of the grain. In these soils, arsenic is a really significant component, and it's a real problem, a class 1 carcinogen. If you grow the crop with less water, there's less arsenic in the rice. And so we're quite interested in this, and very large numbers of farmers, 100,000 Bangladeshi farmers, will be using this irrigation technique, which has been partly developed here in Lancaster during the coming dry season. So that's, I would argue, that is not a trivial effect, and it's potentially quite an important piece of work for a group working in a university like this in a part of the world where we just don't experience these kind of threats. The other food safety issue that I just wanted to touch on, because it is very much in the news at the moment, is the question of GM food. There doesn't seem to be much doubt that you can use genetic modification to change the quality of food. And the high profile example of this is golden rice, which has been engineered to produce vitamin A. Now the reason for that is that vitamin A deficiency is the biggest cause of childhood blindness in the world, and 6,000 children die, around 6,000 children die, you'll be aware that there are strong feelings in this country and other parts of Northern Europe and other parts of the world about eating GM food. The issue here is people who are most susceptible to these problems commonly eat rice. There is an argument that there is an alternative, that people could eat vegetables, but in that culture, in that part of the world, vegetables are just not available. And so, you know, we're faced with a question over the use of GM. Are there alternatives realistically? Is there alternative genetics? And there's been an argument within the Conservative Party. The Environment Secretary, Owen Paterson, you remember a few weeks ago, described people who oppose this science as evil. And then Zach Goldsmith, who's an MP, I think for Richmond, responded a couple of weeks ago to say Paterson didn't understand the science, there were alternatives. Now, in Goldsmith's argument, he said, oh, you could use hybrid rice and achieve many of the same things. But I mean, one of the difficulties that people have identified with GM food is that when this was first introduced, the companies were keen to try to retain all of the intellectual property themselves, and they put a gene in which meant farmers had to buy seed from them every year. And this was a catastrophic error, public relations error by the companies. This rice doesn't have that gene, it's publicly available, and no one's going to make any money out of this. Interestingly, the technique that Goldsmith was proposing in his argument, which was to produce hybrids, does require farmers to buy seed every year. So there's a real problem with the rhetoric, there's a real problem with a lack of understanding of the science, which is perhaps not surprising, it's complex. But the point I want to make is we really need to get to grips with this. We need to have serious debates. You know, here we are in a relatively low threat environment where 6,000 children are dying every day from these kinds of problems. Surely we can do better than simply say, well, we're a bit worried that it's not natural. I'm not necessarily, I can think of plenty of arguments against GM and indeed many other kinds of technology, but I haven't heard too many good ones against GM rice. Right, I've got about 5 minutes left. Where am I? I was going to talk about food prices. I think I'm going to skip over that because everybody understands what a problem expensive food is. I'll talk a little bit about the environment because this is another area where Lancaster has some very strong work going on. I talked about the fact that farming can deliver lots of services and there's too much information in here, but you can see some of those things. Aesthetics. We all like the way the country, or most of us like the way the countryside looks. We use it for recreation, for education, spiritual purposes. It regulates flooding for us. It purifies water. It has an impact, in many cases, positive impact on the climate. I could probably press this without having to try and reach up there. And as well as providing food and other forms of fuel and clothing. And then you can see how these things translate into constituents of well-being for us. So it's really important that we shouldn't just say, we need more food, need more fuel, doesn't matter, you know, that's a top priority. We fully recognise that, but I think we also need to recognise that things that have gone to a really serious state of affairs. And this is quite a well-known paper which describes a safe operating space for humanity, which is this green circle. And in these red areas, we are already into serious problems. And this is biodiversity loss. This is nitrogen cycle. and other nutrients. That's climate change. Water is in here as well. So, we've already got a major problem, and that's manifest in this kind of thing. Again, something I think probably many people are aware of. We need to take these issues very, very seriously. Is this the answer? Many people would say yes, others would say, well, yes, but organic farming generally is quite extensive and can be quite damaging in terms of greenhouse gases. There are positives and negatives, but again, these are areas where we need to have a serious debate to decide how we want to use our land, how do we want Britain to look, what are we able to tolerate. Maybe we can tolerate different kinds of manipulation of the landscape in parts of Britain, and there are other areas where we would feel passionately that it needed to be protected. They're sophisticated arguments. Again, this is something that Waitrose and their suppliers, through an assessment, have tried to find out where we are in UK and indeed with some of their overseas suppliers as well, in terms of the impact, positive and negative, of what they do on the environment. And that provides the agenda for researchers to focus attention. It's not ideal, but I think it's a story that probably surprises quite a lot of people. Our colleague Carly Stevens at Lancaster is very interested in the impacts of the way farming practice, way that farming food production is practiced, and the impact on biodiversity, and whether there are principles here that we could establish which would have positive rather than less negative. And this is a project that's actually funded by Waitrose, with some co-funding also from the government. Okay, so I talked about the dominance of large supermarkets at the outset. I'm not sure I want to say any more about it, but it is something that people might want to raise. I've talked about big-scale traditional farming. One of the things that we're trying to do here is to think, well, are there different ways of producing food? Could we produce food a lot closer to the centres of population? And these are some rather futuristic ideas. Detroit is often chosen because there's an enormous amount of derelict land in Detroit. Are there local food systems? This is something that Becky specialises in, and others around the university. We're trying to start a debate in this area, and this is actually Becky's slide, and this is really the take-home message: building the vision, a sustainable regional food system. And we call it the onion diagram, where you move from something which might involve producing plants, animals and fish in the city or whatever, through sustainable landscapes, and then people are included in this as well, sustainable communities. So we don't have to accept the fact that we buy everything in supermarkets. There are alternatives, but it does require, sorry, there's something very strange going on here. There's some really important things, but I'm sure that Becky would be delighted to talk more about this, indeed, as would I. But we're having this debate, we hope, with producers and interested people locally. And we would hope that maybe there could be something scaled to the region that could make a real difference to people's lives. Can I take 2 minutes, Alan? Is that? He's not here. Is it okay? I just wanted to show you two very quick success stories which we're really proud of. They're described there. It's a system of irrigation which was developed here based on our knowledge of fundamental plant science, and Lancaster won an award for it. And then I want to just say a little bit about the application of that system in one of the driest parts of the world. And again, I'm talking particularly to the younger people here. This work was done by a group of us in the lab. Some of the people are here tonight. There's one person, particularly from China, who I mentioned was an inspiration to us all. Very, very simple research projects. I suspect those people, if you'd asked them 10 years ago, do you really think you'll be impacting on the lives of hundreds and thousands of people in China, would have said, me? No, I'm just doing my PhD. But within 10 years, we've got to a point where, as a result of some good quality science that was done here, I think people's lives are changing for the better. The idea is a simple idea based around manipulating the agroecology of the plant, effectively the whole system. I haven't got really time to go into that, but not just making an improved genotype, but looking to see, are there things in the soil which we could utilize? Could we put water on in a particular way, nutrients on in a particular way? Could we use things like intercropping or rotations in a more traditional agriculture, something often which is referred to as conservation agriculture, to rather than plough the land, put seeds into unploughed land to reduce erosion, to reduce loss of greenhouse gases, loss of nutrients. And the system which we've worked on was based on a fundamental piece of research, and this is the only science I'm going to talk about, trying to understand how plants detected soil drying and then sent that information around the plant, so that signaled to the rest of the plant the soil's drying. And this is the group. Here we are at Buckingham Palace. Chris Bonington wasn't actually part of our group, but he came along to support us. You'll know some of these people. Our ultimate aim is to grow more yield using less water. And this is the guy really around whom we all coalesced. He came here as a visiting scientist. He's a Chinese farmer. He'd farmed a small plot of land in China with his father. He's the kind of person who pays attention to what goes on around him. And he came here and he tested out some of the ideas that he generated while trying to produce enough food to survive in China. And when you listen to him talk, and I know some of you have heard him talk, he'll stand here and he'll say, I should be 3 inches taller, but for 2 years I had virtually nothing to eat. And that really concentrated his mind. This is an article in Nature. If anybody's interested, I can send you the reference to this. It's a very good story. He arrived in Lancaster. I met him at the bus station. He'd learned his English from reading Charles Dickens, so he had a very particular turn of phrase, but he's become a good family friend, not just to our family, but to most of the families of the people you saw in those diagrams. It's a simple idea. It means putting less water on in particular ways, and most simply, when crops are grown with furrows and ridges, just watering every other furrow. It sounds too simple. It obviously saves water, but it stimulates this signaling, and the results of that can be dramatic. And this is some of his work on cotton in a particular region of China where they actually grow nearly 10% of the cotton in all the world. And by applying this technique, this is the water that they save annually. Now, you can give that to people to drink. You can do anything you like. You can plant more food if you like. It's not trivial, but actually it's even better than that. And this is a slightly complex diagram, but it shows us that a very mild water stress with normal nitrogen has no effect on grain yield. High nitrogen can actually reduce grain yield, and we understand why that is. It stops the carbon going to the grains. If you give those high nitrogen plants water stress, that stimulates the reallocation of the carbohydrates into the grains. You can do it genetically, but just by applying less water, you can actually achieve significantly more yield than you can in a well-watered plant, and even more in a plant that's well-watered and normal nitrogen. That's the kind of result that you can get from understanding how a plant works and how you might exploit the biology. And this is what's at stake. It's been applied in this oasis in northwest China. This is not a trivial area. It's 100 miles, is it kilometers, I think, long, 50 wide. It's surrounded by desert. The prediction is that in 20 years, if nothing's done, that oasis will disappear because the farmers are using too much water. And this is the stream flow over 50 years as a result of too much water being used in the upper reaches of this valley. The bottom, the river is dry by the time it reaches the lower reach. The result of that is the farmers drill for water, they pump water from groundwater, and you can see here over 25 years the groundwater levels are dropping, and many farmers now are having to pump water from 200 meters down. Now the impact of that on their farming operation is pretty dramatic, but the impact on the natural vegetation is disaster. And so the wells are dry, this is desertification. There are dust storms in areas where there never were dust storms before, really unpleasant, frightening, and communities are just dying. And in fact, the Chinese government is moving people out because agriculture cannot sustain their lives. But the local scientists have engaged, and Zhang, the scientist I talked about, is one of those people, have engaged with the farmers. They're practicing water-saving agriculture. There are lots of components to that, but our irrigation system is one. They save enough water to plant drought-resistant plants in the desert to stop the sand moving, and they're beginning to see the water tables. First of all, initially, and these data show the water tables are not dropping so catastrophically. Now, the latest data suggests the water table is coming back up. They're restoring the environment. So this is a piece of Lancaster science that's been applied along with a number of other things. We're not entirely responsible for this. Over hundreds and thousands of hectares and affecting the lives of thousands of people. So there is a lot to play for. There's a lot that can be achieved in a university like this with bright young people. There's a lot still to do. I feel strongly it's important that we try to raise the profile of these issues, and I'm grateful for the opportunity tonight to do that. I think there are global and local opportunities, both high and low tech. We need to work together across the disciplines, and we're particularly interested in using some new media to try to spread the word and illustrate best practice in farming systems around the world. I'll finish. Sorry, I've gone on rather too long. Thank you very much.